You possibly hear from some old school Army veterans and military veterans talking about how it was much harder back in their day in the military, in the Army, compared to soldiers nowadays. And soldiers nowadays maybe have it easy compared to the way they have it. And that might be the case in some situations, but we're gonna try to break that down. You see, I'm Christopher Chaos, and I want to explain to you what was harder in my day when I was in the Army compared to what soldiers go through now, but also what was easier back in my day compared to what soldiers go through now in the Army. What's up, my friends? Welcome to the video. Let's break down some of the things that were harder back in my day, but also some things that were easier back in my day, because I don't claim that, the Army is easier now or harder now compared to when I was in. It's definitely different, but I don't know if I could really say that it's easier or harder. There are definitely some factors that do weigh into this, that, this was easier, this was harder, and that's what I want to break down. I want to explain to you some things. And, maybe if you're someone that's currently in the Army and you've heard some stories from veterans, maybe you're someone that got out of the Army, I want to hear some of your experiences down below in the comments section as far as what do you feel maybe was easier back when you were in, maybe things that were harder back when you were in the Army, or even the military in general. I'd love to hear about it down in the comment section. I want to kick it off with something that was definitely harder back in my day, as we like to kind of refer to it, I guess. Back in my days in the Army, it was harder living in the barracks. Not to say that it's easy to live in the barracks nowadays, but it was definitely a lot harder to live in the barracks when I was in, because the barracks were a lot different when I first joined the Army. They did progressively get better, but when I first came in the Army, all it was just maybe like a square room and maybe 2 people in that room if you were lucky. It might be 4 people in that room, might be 3 people in that room. If you were a non-commissioned officer, yeah, you might get your own room kind of a thing, but E4 and below, you probably had to share that room with another soldier or multiple soldiers. And they weren't like separate rooms, it was just one empty room. And if you wanted some privacy, you had to use the wall lockers that we had, which were pretty tall wall lockers, maybe about like 6.5 foot, something like that, 6 foot wall lockers, and split them down the room, and maybe even have to use some sheets to give you additional privacy, because maybe the wall lockers wasn't enough to really divide the room in half. And that was the privacy you had. Now, when I say that this was a square room, that's it. Square room, furniture, wall lockers, no bathroom in these rooms. If you had to utilize the bathroom, take a shower, shave, brush your teeth, whatever, you had to go down the hall to a community bathroom that you would have on every floor. So if you woke up in the middle of the night and maybe you're someone who likes to sleep butt naked, you probably had to get dressed, unless you were just gonna expose yourself to everybody that possibly might be up at that time of night going to use the bathroom or doing something else, walking down the halls, to go down to the community bathroom because you didn't have your own private bathroom. That also meant that you had to clean those bathrooms. You didn't have like cleaning crews doing it. You would have some kind of probably rotational thing or some kind of cleaning days where everybody in the barracks would clean their bathrooms on their floor and clean their hallways and all that kind of stuff. They did progressively get a little bit better, where it did get to the point where it has like a kitchen and then 2 separate rooms at one point in time, to where you do have a lot more privacy. And in fact, they're even improving upon that, because I actually saw a video from a soldier in, I think, Fort Drum, that had an amazing barracks. I don't know if all the barracks are eventually going to go to this, but in this barracks, you walked in, there was a small kitchenette, there was a closet that had their own washer and dryer to do their laundry, not a community one like most barracks usually have. They had their own washer and dryer in their barracks room. Then it opened up into a living room. It didn't have greatest furniture. It was like your typical Army style furniture of typical like cloth material with like this wooden frame type of thing, and then a coffee table and then a stand to put a TV on. And then off to the side was their own room, and inside the room wasn't your normal twin size bed like most barracks usually have. This one, I believe, was a full size bed. So if that's eventually what barracks are going to, that's getting a lot better. You do still have, of course, your leadership checking up on you all the time and certain other things that makes the barracks maybe suck still a little bit, but definitely not as bad as when I first joined the Army. But like I said, not everything from back in my day was harder compared to nowadays. There are some things that were easier. One of those was, I feel like back in my time in the Army when I first came in, the physical fitness test was easier than what the current physical fitness test is. See, when I came in the Army, they had the normal APFT, which was the 2 minutes of push-ups, 2 minutes of sit-ups, and then a 2-mile run. 3 events. All you needed to be able to do that event or do that physical fitness test was a stopwatch and maybe something to write the information on. The nowadays physical fitness test, the Army Combat Fitness Test, or the ACFT, that's 6 events, and you need some equipment. So you can't just go and do a diagnostic one to see where you stand, to get a good estimate of what you need to work on. You need a lot of equipment. You have a lot more events to do. I know a lot of people say that it's actually fairly easy to pass the ACFT, but you have 6 events. You're definitely gonna be more tired compared to the previous version of doing only 3 events. Now, technically, as I'm making this video, that one's not even fully effect yet. I mean, there's a lot of units that are taking the ACFT, but that really doesn't go full effect until October of 2022. So nonetheless, that is the new standard of it, and I feel like that ACFT is harder than the APFT, even though, like I said, some people claim that it's pretty easy to pass, but when you compare the two, I feel like the ACFT is harder. Especially since 2 of the APFT events, the push-ups and the run, is still in the ACFT, but then they add all the other events. I mean, the push-ups is a little bit different, but nonetheless, you do still have those same 2 events, but now you've added some additional events to now get 6 instead of 3. Something that was harder back when I first came in the Army was getting ready for work. And in the sense of the uniforms and the boots were different when I first came in the Army. For the first 4 years that I was in the Army, we were still in the BDU uniform with the black boots that you had to polish. So to get ready in the morning or maybe the night before, whatever you wanted to do, you had to shine your boots. You had to probably iron your uniform to get like a crease in it, or you would take it to the dry cleaners to get them pressed and get that nice crisp starch look. I actually like that look. I think it looks pretty cool, but current day Army doesn't do that. They don't shine their boots because it's not the style of boots you have to shine. And you also don't iron your uniform or press your uniform. So it's much quicker and easier to get ready for going off to formation, off to work, to do whatever you gotta do compared to the way it was when I first came in. Now, eventually I went to like the ACUs and everything like that, and I ditched, being able to, or having to shine my boots. But the initial time frame when I first came in the Army, definitely much harder than current day stuff. Something that was easier back in my day of the Army that means a lot to some people currently in the Army is to get a combat patch. To be able to have that patch insignia on your other sleeve to show that you've been to a combat environment. There was a ton of deployments going on between about 2005, 2015. If you were in the Army during that time frame, most likely you're gonna deploy to a combat zone, either to Iraq or Afghanistan, and you're gonna end up with a combat patch. After 2015, it became a little bit more scarce, right? We still had some deployments to Afghanistan, but not really as much as there was going on, and there wasn't as many people going to Iraq anymore either, so it started dwindling down, and now you've gotten to the point where they've gotten rid of Afghanistan, so right now, as of currently making this video, really the only combat deployment that most soldiers are going on is Iraq, and that's not even that many people still that are going to Iraq. But we do still have operations going on in Iraq, so we do have soldiers going to Iraq and earning that combat patch, so it was definitely a lot easier for my time frame for you to end up going on a deployment, which isn't necessarily a great thing, but a lot of people do like the bragging rights or the, the coolness, whatever, of having a combat patch and being able to say that you actually did, your military job in a combat zone type of thing, rather than just always training for it. So for that reason, it's sometimes means a lot to some people. And some people don't want to deploy, and that's fine, right? But there are also a lot of people currently that wish they could deploy. They want to earn that combat patch. They want to actually do their job in a combat environment type of thing. But that was much easier of a thing to end up getting while I was in because of the rapid deployment pace compared to nowadays that is not quite so rapid. There's a lot of training deployments that don't earn you a combat patch, but combat deployments, not a whole lot right now. That could change very easily, something could happen, and maybe it does become quite easier, but as of right now, not quite so easy. Back when I was in the Army, when I first initial kind of area, or most of my Army career, it was a lot harder to earn some extra cash. If you wanted to earn more than just your base pay on active duty, and you wanted to go get a side job, that was a lot harder to do when I was in. And the reason for that is, if you wanted to get some extra cash from a side job, that means you had to go find an employer to do some kind of part-time work, maybe some night shift at a club to do a bouncer work, stocking some shelves at like the commissary at a Walmart or something like that. And so you had to get special permission usually from your leadership, unless you just kind of went behind their back and did it, but you had to get special permission for that. So you had to have that kind of a part-time job that still required a schedule, and that was your way to try to earn a little bit of extra money. Nowadays, you have a lot of ways that it doesn't require you to be set to a schedule. You can do Uber, you can do Lyft, you can do DoorDash, you can do, heck, I guess YouTube and Twitch. Those maybe take a little bit of time, a little bit of hard work kind of a thing, but all of those, you set your own schedule and can work at your own pace and earn some extra cash, where we didn't have those kind of services during my time in the Army. That's services that didn't come until probably around the time I was getting out of the Army type of thing. So in that sense, I feel like it's a lot easier nowadays for you to earn a little bit extra cash on the side at your own pace compared to when I was in the Army. Now, when I was in the Army, it was much easier to qualify with your rifle. To qualify with your M16, your M4, the weapons qualification was so much easier than it is now. When I did weapons qualification, you had 2 magazines. Each magazine held 20 rounds. You started off inside of a foxhole, 20 rounds with, I think you had the sandbags for a supported position to fire at the targets, and then you would get out of that foxhole and lay in the prone position and do 20 more rounds, and that was it. The current one, you transition from different positions behind this wooden board thing to go from standing to kneeling to prone. You have certain magazines, you have to like change them out during the transition and everything like that, because it's not just 2 magazines, 1 magazine for each iteration. It's multiple magazines that maybe during that iteration, you're gonna have to do a mag swap to be able to switch magazines. So the weapons qualification nowadays is probably better, but it is harder than it was when I did weapons qualification. Still the same 40 targets, but the way you have to fire at these 40 targets, much more complicated than it was with just simply the 2 firing positions that I started off doing when I first came in the Army. Later, they started transitioning to like the standing and the kneeling position, and it's even gotten more complicated over the years. But initially, when I first came in, you just had the 2 positions, inside the foxhole, outside the foxhole, 20 rounds, 20 rounds. Something that was harder back in my day was dealing with leadership. It was definitely a different type of leadership style, things that they could do that they can't do in today's Army. This is probably a common one that some people talk about, especially like old school days, talking about how, you know, oh, my drill sergeants used to beat me, or my NCOs used to do wall-to-wall counseling, as we would call it, which meant you're just getting slammed up against a wall kind of a thing, which that is definitely extreme and probably not something that's going to retain soldiers, which is what we need in today's Army, is to retain soldiers for a long time, not discourage them from wanting to stay in, because who the hell wants to take that kind of abuse all the time? So that's not going to retain soldiers. But even that was outside of my days in the Army. I didn't really experience that kind of a thing. That's a little bit more old school, like 80s and 70s kind of, experiences. But I did have still leadership. They would smoke the crap out of you. If you messed up, you would have to, go do front back goes, do a crap ton of push-ups, roll around in the mud, whatever it is they felt like they wanted to do to you. If they wanted to yell at you and cuss at you and, bug the hell out of you inside the barracks, they could do that kind of stuff. Now, in today's Army, that's more frowned upon. It might happen in some cases, but it's definitely not accepted like it was back in those days. Now it's quite, heavily frowned upon for you to do that kind of a thing. You can't just smoke the dog shit out of a soldier just because they were a little bit late. They have to have some kind of punishment that meets the crime kind of a thing. You can't treat soldiers in a certain way because it could be labeled as hazing. You can't bug the hell out of soldiers and do constant everyday room inspections because that is harassment in the barracks. In some ways, I'm not saying that that's bad, right? I'm not that kind of person that says, oh, I wish it was back in the day where NCOs used to beat soldiers kind of a thing. No, we, like I said, need to retain soldiers. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a weak Army because nobody wants to be in the Army, because nobody wants to volunteer to be treated like that. But nonetheless, it definitely was harder to deal with leadership back in those days because of the things that they were allowed to get away with compared to the things nowadays that are more frowned upon, that they're not allowed to get away with. But like I said, some of that stuff does still happen. It's just definitely frowned upon in today's Army. So doing something like that could result in that person getting in trouble if that soldier was to complain to the Inspector General, the IG, or complain to higher leadership or whatever that is pretty strict on enforcing those kind of things. So definitely a little easier with leadership nowadays compared to back in my day. And one last one, something that was easier back in my day. It was easier to make some serious mistakes in the Army and stay in the Army. Specifically is what I'm talking about is back in those days, if you had a soldier that got a DUI, you had a soldier that came up hot on a drug test for maybe marijuana, cocaine, whatever, they could stay in the Army. They would probably get reduced in rank. They would get Article 15, so they would go from, let's say they were an E4 when it happened, they'd probably go all the way back down to an E1 and have to do some extra duty in the evenings and reduction in pay and everything like that, but they could possibly, most likely, stay in the Army. Current day's Army has basically a no tolerance for that kind of a thing. There might be some cases where people just get Article 15s, but your majority of soldiers, if they get a DUI, if they come up hot on the drug test, they're getting chaptered out of the Army. They're getting kicked out of the Army. So back in those days when I first came in the Army, and most of my Army career anyways, yes, most people did just get reduced in rank. There were some people that would get chaptered for those kind of things, depending on how the leadership was, but the higher percentage of people was mostly just getting Article 15s reduced in rank kind of a thing, whereas kind of flipped around now to where nowadays, yes, there might be some people that just get Article 15s and get reduced in rank, but the majority of people are getting chaptered out of the Army if they come up hot on a drug test, DUI, certain other offenses that maybe back then would have just resulted in an Article 15. What are your thoughts on some of these, right? Some of you might have been in the time frame that I was in the Army, and maybe even before I was in the Army kind of a thing too, and maybe you have some experiences with things that were harder back in those days, things that were easier back in those days. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I want to hear about them down in the comment section down below, so comment down below, tell me all about it. A common one that you might hear is people talking about like basic training. When they went through basic combat training, it was so much harder than today's basic training. They gone soft, they've got stress cards, not really, but they have, you know, ice cream sundae, something, I don't know. They got it way easier today's basic training compared to when I was in Army basic training. But I did actually do a video reaction to a basic training video from 1980, and if you'd like to see that video, check it out right here. See me react to 1980s Army basic training. If you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up, leave some comments, check out links down in the description box down below, social media, links, all sorts of stuff. Thanks for hanging out. I'm Christopher Chaos, and I'll see you next time. See ya.